So I'll briefly point out this photograph. This is taken from the perspective of the old University of Nashville, which does not exist anymore. This building still exists, but it's used for other purposes now. It's called Lindsley Hall. But if, in the background, you can see that is Fort Negley. That little tiny silhouette on the horizon is Blockhouse Casino, and then over here is Fort Morton. But jumping ahead in time, Battle of Nashville is over. Civil War is ending. If you are a white soldier, you just kind of go home to Indiana, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, whatever. If you're one of these black soldiers, what do? There's actually a few different options, but does anyone have any ideas?
You have no home.
Resettle.
Where do you go? Think geographically.
Back south. North.
Okay, so south. Some they actually return to former places where former plantations. Some of them actually going to former places they themselves have been enslaved, and they carve out new careers as tenant farmers. Whole series of caveats that come with that. First of all, you have to sign a labor contract. Those contracts were always at least a year in length, and you don't get any of the money until the end of the contract. So you're incentivized to be there the entire time to get any money. And then also come up with all these rules, like if you are late to work, it is docked from your pay. If you are caught sleeping, it is docked from your pay. If you leave the property day or night without permission, it is docked from your pay. If you are using a tool and the tool breaks, it is docked from your pay. So they came up with as many excuses as possible to keep money from going to the black laborers. But what's another option?
Start your own business.
Stay in the service of the military.
Try to start
Give
something
me a
else.
cardinal direction.
West.
I go west, yeah.
Some go west, some become cowboys, and when I say cowboy, I mean the authentic use of that word, not the one that shows up in the movies. Others, they do continue service in the military as buffalo soldiers, fighting Native Americans out west. One more.
Direction?
Yeah.
North.
Yeah, some go north, and I will clarify this by saying that almost without exception they go to cities as opposed to the countryside. But that sounds like it could be a lot. If you're coming from the perspective of someone who has grown up on a plantation in kind of an isolated part of the country, and you go somewhere that it's very loud and bustling and congested all of the time, that sounds like it could be a huge culture shock, that it is an option that some people take. But let's say you were one of these men who became a laborer in Nashville and then also became a soldier here. Maybe you return to those squalid, improvised shelters, and you make communities out of them. You start families and you build neighborhoods. Many of the historically black neighborhoods in Nashville tie their origin to where these forts were constructed. So I mentioned before that Fisk University is where Fort Gillem was, and that's not an accident. That North Nashville community grew up out of the building of Fort Gillem. And not long after the war, they established the university in 1866. And did not take them long to generate some prestige for themselves in the form of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. Excuse me. This 9-member choral group, they would travel around, they performed at the White House for President Grant, they went across the Atlantic Ocean, performed for Queen Victoria, all the while sending the money back to help fund the university, and a lot of that money specifically went to the construction of Jubilee Hall, which is still there today, is a registered landmark, and it sits right on top of where Fort Gillem was located. And also along the way, changing the hearts and minds of both whites and blacks who saw these performances, whites who had never considered that blacks were capable of this kind of highbrow of entertainment, but also blacks who had never considered that higher education was something available to them. It's like, what is it, Fisk? Where is it? Nashville? I can go there and I can get an education. So blacks from other parts of the United States start funneling into Nashville to attend the university. Some of them made quite the name for themselves. Ida B. Wells, who wrote about the injustices of lynching around the turn of the 20th century. Famous intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, who later becomes the first black man to graduate from Harvard Medical School, before that attended Fisk. And aside from that, it's pretty much sunshine and rainbows. Slavery doesn't exist anymore. Certainly no threats to the black community either in Nashville or anywhere else in the United States. And if you can't tell, it's a heaping dose of sarcasm. Still significant threats both here and elsewhere. The one that's pretty easy for most people to conjure is going to be the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK targeted Fort Negley specifically. They knew that it was in the middle of this burgeoning black community. They knew that it had been built by black labor. And they also knew that the fort could be seen from just about anywhere else in Nashville. And they burned crosses here. Crosses known to be burned inside Fort Negley as recently as the 1950s. But that is not the only threat. Another large one is urban renewal. So this road out here that the Adventure Science Center sits on was then and is still called Bass Street. Once it curves around, it becomes Fort Negley Boulevard. But this was the basis of a black community, just rows of homes with black families. And the road used to continue off in that direction. Can you see why it no longer can? It's because they built I-65, and that shattered the stability of that community. And this is not something that is exclusive to Nashville. This is something that happened all over the United States, where highways were often built right through the middle of black neighborhoods. Now, whether that's because those areas were targeted maliciously or whether it was just perceived to be land that was easier to acquire, the bottom line is that those neighborhoods disproportionately suffered due to the introduction of the highways. But what of the fort itself? So after the war was over, the Union Army just kind of took everything in military value, all the ammunition and the artillery. Nothing really happened to the fort for decades except decay. The former Confederate citizens of Nashville only saw this as a reminder of the Union occupation, so they are not interested in saving it. If you fast forward to the 1920s, there was actually an attempt to preserve this as a part of the National Park Service. However, it failed. Organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy actively sought to defeat any effort to preserve this fort, and those efforts continued well into the 20th century. But then came the WPA, which stands for Works Progress Administration. In the 1930s, the WPA was a federal program started as a part of the New Deal under President FDR, and they would go into communities. They would build new roads, schools, courthouses, and parks, all of which to revitalize these communities that had suffered during the Great Depression. And they came to Fort Negley, and they rebuilt it. This is a photograph of the WPA working at the fort here. They restacked the walls, they added the pathway that goes around the fort, they added a drainage system, they built that parking lot, they built the archway at the front of the park. They also built many of the stone walls that still go through the perimeter of this neighborhood. After all of their work, the fort was open to the public in 1941. However, again, the fort was derailed by anti-Union sentiment. In 1945, World War II is ending, soldiers are coming home. You think it'd be the perfect time to have a place for people to go and spend time with their families, but that was the year the fort closed. And again, it was allowed to rot. By the 1960s, the hill had been taken over again by trees and invasive plants. In the 1970s, large portions of the property were leased for the Adventure Science Center and Old Greer Stadium. That was kind of the darkest days for Fort Negley, because out of sight, out of mind, the fort was all but forgotten. But then, finally, 1996, pen on paper to once again make this a public park. It opened in 2004, the Visitor Center opened 2007. In 2016, many of the trees that were still on the property were finally cut away. Because I remember coming here like high school and college, you could get on the pathway, but there's this perimeter of trees you couldn't see out like you can now. And 2019, Greer Stadium was demolished. 2022, large repairs to both back and front portions of the walls. It's been a long road to get as far as we have, and a lot of our success has been in cultivating support in the community, and a lot of what that looks like is kind of what I'm doing right now, just explaining what happened here. Because if people don't know, they can't know why it's important. But we are absolutely still a work in progress. This past October, we unveiled the master plan, which is the vision for what this park is going to be in the future. New walking paths, pedestrian plazas, an outdoor classroom, signage that isn't faded, flaking, and defaced, an expanded visitor center. But to me, most importantly, is a memorial to those African Americans without whom the sport would not even be here. I have to tell you, it's a very exciting time to be working here and to be participating in the upward trajectory of this park. But that is about what I have.